Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today's question comes to us from the True Stories collection, as in, it actually happened at an event that I was actually judging. Amy plays a Claim the Firstborn against Nick's Old Growth Troll, and later sacrifices it. When the Old Growth Troll returns to the battlefield, which player will control it? Which player will decide what land that it enchants? Okay, so the first thing that I want to do for this question is take a close look at the wording on Old Growth Troll. You wouldn't believe how many of these questions you could just answer by taking a close read of the card, and a lot of the times it'll just say the answer to questions like these right on there. It's almost like cheating. Unfortunately, it looks like we're getting trolled a little bit here, because the wording on this specific card doesn't actually say anything at all about which specific player is going to control it once it returns to the battlefield. So with that being the case, we're going to have to take a look in the comprehensive rules to see what the default option would be. As you can see here, if you have a player who's putting an object onto the battlefield, then the default would be for that object to enter the battlefield under that player's control. Now that makes sense, and that's all well and good, but it just seems like we kind of just kick the can down the street a little bit. I mean, now we just have to figure out which player is going to be instructed to put Old Growth Troll onto the battlefield. And again, the Old Growth Troll does not actually say that anywhere on the card. So we're going to need to take another look in the comprehensive rules, and we'll see that the person who is performing the instructions is going to be the person who controls the spell, or in this case, triggered ability, that's resolving. So now we need to figure out which player controls that triggered ability. And if you watch my patron pick video that I did for the month of July, then you should think that this looks kind of familiar. I definitely recommend that you check that video out if you're interested in a little bit more background on this sort of thing, but for now I'll just tell you that this sort of triggered ability, a triggered ability that triggers when Old Growth Troll dies, means that the trigger is evaluated based on the game state and the controller immediately before that trigger event happened. In other words, the Old Growth Troll, because Amy was the person who controlled it immediately before it died, is going to have Amy controlling its triggered ability at the time when that triggered ability happens. So now we have enough information to finally get to the full answer for our original question. Amy is the person who controlled Old Growth Troll when it died, therefore Amy is going to control its triggered ability, therefore Amy is going to be instructed to perform the instructions in that triggered ability, and therefore Amy is going to be the one who puts Old Growth Troll onto the battlefield under her control. So with all that being the case, we've got the first answer to our question, and we just need to think a little bit more about what the second part of our question should be. So to see which player is going to choose what the permanent that the Old Growth Troll will be attached to when it enters the battlefield, we're going to need to again take another look in the comprehensive rules, and we can see this one here, which indicates that if you have an aura that's entering the battlefield and there's nothing that says what it's going to get attached to, then you have the person who controls that aura be the person who makes that decision. And so Amy is the one who's going to choose which forest the Old Growth Troll enchants. Actually, this is a little bit of a tricky one though, because as we saw in that rule, Amy needs to choose a legal object for that permanent to be attached to. And that means, based on the enchant ability that the Old Growth Troll has, it needs to be a forest that Amy controls. Now, of course, I'm wondering, what would happen if Amy didn't control any forests? And of course, that's a very important question to be thinking about, because at least as of the time that this video was created, a lot of the time when this sort of situation can come up in a real game of Pioneer, you probably are going to be in that situation. The decks that play the Old Growth Troll have a lot of forests in them, of course, but the decks that play the Claim the Firstborn generally do not. And so it's pretty likely that we would actually have that situation come up if we were going to deal with this as a real judge call. So again, we'll take a look in the comprehensive rules and we'll see this one here, which indicates that if an aura is entering the battlefield and there's no legal object for it to get attached to, then it's just going to stay in its current zone. And so that means that it's going to stay in Nick's graveyard in the case that Amy does not control any forests for it to get attached to. So with this, we've got all of the answers for the questions that were presented in the original problem statement. And I probably can hear some people thinking, hey, you know, that was kind of cool and all, Dave, but is it really a 4-star question, or are you just padding your resume a little bit? And okay, that is kind of an interesting thing. And definitely, if you looked at that question just through the video and were following along with all the comprehensive rules citations that I pulled up to back up every single point that I made, maybe it did seem like it was a little bit of an easy question. But I think that this one has a little bit more going on to it than meets the eye. For starters, All of those answers probably seemed obvious when I was pulling up the comprehensive rules that determined what those answers were, but I think that it's a little bit harder than that in a real actual judge call. If you have a situation like this come up, you would need to know all of those different rules from all of those different parts of the comprehensive rules and how they all work together. Notice that there isn't a whole lot of intuition going on with any of the stuff that I said so far. Even though it's all true, it's kind of not something that's based on how everybody would think that it should work if you asked a bunch of Magic players. Rather, to me at least, it sort of seems more like we had to make a choice, and that's what the choice ended up being. And the only real way to answer a question like that, where the answer is some arbitrary choice that the Magic Rules Committee came up with a long time ago, is really to just know the rules involved and be able to find them if you're needing to come up with that information. And so that's the reason why I think this question is actually probably a little bit more confusing than it might appear if you were just following along with the explanation that I gave when I was saying what the answer was. And to really drive that point home, I had another related question that I wanted to talk about. Let's say that this time, Amy is going to play Claim the Firstborn against Nick's Grizzly Bears. And after that resolves, Jenna is going to play a Stasis Snare against the Grizzly Bears. After the Stasis Snare is destroyed, which player will control Grizzly Bears? Now, if you are following along with the answer that I gave for the original question, then maybe you would think that the answer for this one should be that Jenna would control the Grizzly Bears. After all, presumably, the Stasis Snare is going to be the thing that returns the Grizzly Bears to the battlefield, and with that being the case, the answer, in parallel with the last one, seems like it should be that Jenna should be the one who controls that Grizzly Bears, since she would be putting it onto the battlefield. However, it turns out that's not actually the correct answer for this question. If you have a card that's specifically worded the way that Stasis Snare is, where it exiles something until Stasis Snare leaves the battlefield, and this is actually a pretty common template to see for a lot of other related cards that do similar sorts of things, it turns out that if you have a card that exiles something this way, then there's a very specific set of rules that governs that type of an interaction. And as you can see here, if you have that sort of an effect, then the person who is going to control the Grizzly Bears once it re-enters the battlefield is actually going to be its owner, not the person who controlled the Grizzly Bears at the time when it left the battlefield, and not the person who controlled the effect that caused the Grizzly Bears to get exiled. That's kind of trippy. And the fact that this situation is so similar to the other one that we talked about with the Old Growth Troll, combined with the fact that these rules all kind of seem like they were made up just because we needed some rule that would cover this situation, and not on the basis of any sort of intuitive feel for what the answer should be, I feel like both of those situations together combine to make this sort of question a lot harder than it might seem at first glance. But that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Do you agree with me that this question is actually deserving of a 4-star rating, or do you think it's actually easier? Join me again next time for another daily ruling, but until then, I hope you have a great day.